People often believe $1 billion can buy anything in the world, but the truth is that sometimes it can only buy a single chance to change a life. On a quiet winter evening in Manhattan, the skyline glowed like a sea of glass and light, and inside one of the tallest towers in the city sat a man who owned more wealth than most people could imagine, yet could not stand on his own feet. Ethan Caldwell, founder and CEO of Caldwell Technologies, was only 38 years old and already worth more than $5 billion. The kind of man whose decisions could move markets before breakfast and reshape entire industries before dinner. But 3 years earlier, a mysterious car accident had changed everything, leaving him confined to a sleek carbon fiber wheelchair that cost more than most Americans made in a year. The newspapers called him the frozen king of Silicon Avenue, a billionaire genius who had rebuilt his empire after tragedy, but never quite returned to the world outside the cold glass walls of his penthouse. Inside that penthouse, overlooking Central Park from nearly 80 floors above the street, silence had become his closest companion. Doctors had tried everything modern medicine could offer, from experimental nerve therapies to robotic rehabilitation machines. Yet none of it had restored the one thing Ethan Caldwell truly wanted: the simple ability to stand up and walk across a room without assistance. And because the Caldwell family controlled a corporate empire worth tens of billions, the board of directors had begun whispering about succession, stability, and the fragile balance of power that held the company together. That was why, on this particular night, a group of lawyers and advisors stood around a polished walnut table discussing something that sounded less like romance and more like a business merger. Their proposal was simple, almost absurd in its bluntness. Ethan Caldwell would marry. Not for love, not for companionship, but for the future of the company and the protection of the Caldwell legacy. The marriage would be arranged through a legal contract lasting 1 year, carefully designed with clauses that read more like corporate agreements than wedding vows. And to ensure cooperation, the compensation would be unprecedented: $1 billion. Across the city, several miles south in a modest brick building in Brooklyn, a woman named Naomi Carter had just finished locking the doors of a small community health clinic where she volunteered long hours helping families who could barely afford medical care. Naomi was 27, with calm brown eyes and the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that kindness could be stronger than power. She had no idea that at that exact moment a legal team was reviewing her background, her education, and every detail of her life, because someone inside the Caldwell organization believed she might be the perfect candidate for a marriage that would begin as a contract and end as a headline. By midnight, Naomi Carter would receive a phone call that sounded like something from a strange dream. Marry a billionaire CEO who could not walk, remain his wife for 1 year, and receive $1 billion gift. Most people would laugh and hang up. But Naomi Carter did not laugh. Instead, she listened quietly, staring out the frosted clinic window at the cold Brooklyn streetlights, unaware that the decision she was about to make would not only transform her life, but might also become the miracle that the most powerful man in New York had already stopped believing was possible. The phone call came at 12:17 in the morning, long after the clinic lights had been turned off and the quiet Brooklyn street outside had settled into the calm rhythm of winter. Naomi Carter stood alone beside the reception desk, her coat draped over one arm and the soft hum of an old refrigerator the only sound in the room. When her phone rang, she almost ignored it, assuming it was one of the parents who often called late asking about appointments or medication instructions. But the number on the screen carried a Manhattan area code she did not recognize. She answered cautiously, her voice calm but curious. The man on the other end spoke with the polished tone of someone accustomed to boardrooms and contracts. He introduced himself as Daniel Reeves, senior legal counsel for Caldwell Technologies, and within the first 30 seconds Naomi realized this was not a mistake. The lawyer explained that Mr. Ethan Caldwell required a legal spouse for a 1-year contractual arrangement that would remain completely private and professionally structured. Naomi listened without interrupting, her eyes drifting toward the worn photographs on the clinic wall showing years of community health fairs and volunteer teams. The proposal sounded unreal, the kind of offer that belonged in headlines or late-night television dramas. Yet Daniel Reeves continued with the same steady professionalism, as if he were describing a routine business deal. At the conclusion of the 1-year contract, Naomi Carter would receive a financial transfer equal to 1 billion United States dollars. The number seemed to hang in the air like a distant echo. Naomi did not gasp or laugh. Instead, she leaned against the counter and asked the only question that truly mattered to her. Why me? There was a brief pause before the lawyer answered with careful honesty. Mr. Caldwell had personally reviewed a list of candidates who met certain criteria including education, reputation, and independence from corporate influence. Naomi Carter had studied physical rehabilitation during college before shifting into nonprofit healthcare work. She had no financial ties to competing corporations, no public scandals, and according to the background report, she had spent nearly every weekend for the past 4 years volunteering in community clinics rather than attending social events. The Caldwell legal team believed she possessed something difficult to quantify, but extremely valuable: integrity. Naomi remained silent for a moment after the explanation ended. Outside the clinic window, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the street, its headlights cutting through the cold air as snow began drifting softly across the sidewalk. She thought about the clinic's monthly budget meetings where every dollar was stretched to cover medicine and supplies. She thought about the outdated equipment in the therapy room that the children still used, because replacing it would cost more than the building's annual rent. $1 billion could rebuild every community clinic in the borough. It could fund scholarships, research programs, and free treatment for thousands of families who currently had nowhere else to go. The lawyer asked if she would consider flying to Manhattan the next day to meet Mr. Caldwell in person before making a final decision. Naomi slowly placed her coat on the chair behind her and walked toward the window. Across the street, a street lamp cast a pale circle of light onto the sidewalk where the falling snow glowed like tiny sparks. She imagined the life waiting at the top of one of those shining towers across the river. A world of elevators, marble floors, and quiet penthouse rooms where a man who owned everything still could not stand on his own feet. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steady and thoughtful. She told the lawyer that she would meet Mr. Caldwell, but she would only agree to the contract if she could speak with him directly, without lawyers interrupting the conversation. Daniel Reeves accepted the condition immediately, sounding almost relieved. As the call ended, Naomi remained by the window, watching the snowfall grow heavier over Brooklyn. Somewhere far above the glowing skyline of Manhattan, a billionaire who had stopped believing in miracles was waiting for a stranger to decide whether his future would remain exactly the same or begin to change in ways no contract could ever predict. The next morning, Manhattan woke beneath a pale winter sun that turned the glass towers along the Hudson River into columns of silver light. And somewhere near the top of one of those towers, a private elevator carried Naomi Carter upward faster than any elevator she had ever stepped inside before. The ride from Brooklyn had taken less than 30 minutes. Yet it felt as though she had traveled into another world entirely. The lobby of Caldwell Tower looked less like an office building and more like a museum of quiet power, with polished marble floors stretching wider than a basketball court and walls of dark stone reflecting soft golden lighting. People moved through the space with calm efficiency, men and women in tailored suits speaking in low voices, while security staff watched everything with careful attention. Naomi stood near the reception desk for only a moment before a tall assistant approached and greeted her by name, as if she had been expected for weeks rather than hours. She was escorted through a series of silent corridors and into a private elevator that required a security badge before the doors would even close. As the elevator rose higher and higher, the city slowly unfolded beyond the glass wall behind her, Central Park spreading out like a quiet island of green and white beneath the winter sky. When the doors finally opened, Naomi stepped into a penthouse office so large and bright that for a moment she forgot the purpose of her visit. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire room, offering a view that stretched nearly 20 miles in every direction. The furniture was elegant but restrained: polished walnut tables, deep gray sofas, and a single long desk positioned near the windows as if the person who worked there preferred to keep the entire city within sight. Near that desk sat Ethan Caldwell. His wheelchair faced the skyline, his posture straight and controlled, the kind of presence that could command attention even in silence. When Naomi entered, he turned slowly, studying her with calm gray eyes that revealed almost nothing. He looked younger than she had expected, his dark hair neatly trimmed and his expression composed in the way of someone who had learned to hide both disappointment and curiosity behind the same quiet mask. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Naomi walked forward at an unhurried pace until she stood a few feet from the desk, close enough to see the faint reflection of the skyline in the polished surface of his chair. Ethan was the first to break the silence. He thanked her for agreeing to come and explained that he preferred direct conversations rather than long negotiations through attorneys. Naomi nodded slightly and took the seat opposite him, placing her hands calmly on the table between them. The city shimmered outside the windows behind him as he spoke again, this time explaining the proposal with the same clarity that had made him one of the most respected business leaders in the country. The contract would last exactly 12 months. During that time, Naomi would live at the Caldwell residence, attend several public events when necessary, and maintain the appearance of a legitimate marriage. In exchange, she would receive financial compensation that would be transferred in full once the contract ended. His tone remained steady and practical, almost as if he were describing the purchase of a company rather than a wedding. When he finished speaking, he looked at her with quiet expectation. Naomi studied him carefully before answering. She did not ask about the money again. Instead, she asked him a different question. Why does a man who built one of the largest technology companies in America need a stranger to pretend to be his wife? Ethan leaned back slightly, the faintest shadow of amusement touching his expression for the first time. He explained that large corporations often depended on stability in ways the public rarely understood. Investors preferred leaders who appeared settled, families preferred heirs, and board members preferred certainty over speculation. A married chief executive officer projected permanence. Naomi listened without interrupting, then asked one more question that seemed to surprise him. If this is only a contract, what happens if I refuse? Ethan met her eyes directly. Then the contract disappears, and you walk out of this building with nothing except the knowledge that you were offered an unusual opportunity. Naomi looked toward the skyline for a moment, the snow still drifting slowly across Central Park below. When she turned back, her expression remained thoughtful but steady. She told him that before she could decide anything, she needed to know one more thing. She asked if he truly believed that his condition was permanent, or if somewhere inside him he still hoped that one day he might stand up again and walk across this very room. For the first time since the conversation began, Ethan Caldwell did not answer immediately. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the penthouse office was the distant murmur of traffic far below the tower and the quiet hum of the climate system hidden within the walls. Ethan Caldwell remained still behind his desk, his gray eyes drifting briefly toward the endless stretch of Manhattan outside the windows, as if the question Naomi Carter had asked had reached a place inside him that most people never touched. Finally he spoke, but his voice carried none of the confidence that had defined his earlier explanations. He admitted that for the first year after the accident, he had believed recovery was possible. He had hired the best neurologists in the country, traveled to rehabilitation centers from Boston to San Diego, and invested millions of dollars into treatments that promised progress but delivered only careful disappointment. Each specialist had spoken with polite optimism while quietly preparing him for the same conclusion. The damage to his spinal nerves appeared permanent. Eventually, Ethan stopped asking about new therapies. Instead, he redirected his attention toward the only thing that still responded to his control, the company he had built from nothing 10 years earlier inside a small rented office with 2 engineers and a borrowed computer server. Naomi listened carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than sympathetic, and when he finished, she did not respond with pity. Instead, she asked him if any of those doctors had explained exactly which nerves had been damaged and which ones had only stopped communicating properly with the brain. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, clearly surprised by the precision of the question. He admitted that the reports were complicated but available, and with a small motion of his hand, he activated the large tablet resting on his desk. Within seconds, a series of medical files appeared on the screen. Naomi leaned forward just enough to study the documents while Ethan watched her with growing curiosity. She read silently for several minutes, her eyes moving slowly across the scans and physician notes while the pale winter sunlight shifted across the office floor. Finally, she looked up again. Her voice remained calm and certain. She explained that during college she had studied physical rehabilitation and neuromuscular therapy, before choosing community health work instead of a hospital career. The human nervous system often behaved like a complex network rather than a single switch. Sometimes injuries caused communication pathways to shut down even when the underlying structures still existed. In those cases, recovery depended less on expensive machines and more on patience, repetition, and carefully guided movement that retrained the body to remember signals it had forgotten. Ethan listened without interrupting, though the faint skepticism in his eyes remained visible. Naomi did not appear offended by his doubt. Instead, she asked him a simple request. She asked if he would allow her to examine the movement in his hands and shoulders for a moment. After a brief pause, Ethan nodded. Naomi stood and moved beside the wheelchair, her movements careful and professional as she gently asked him to lift his right arm. The motion was slow but controlled. She then asked him to rotate his wrist and flex his fingers. Again, the movement responded, though slightly stiff. Naomi observed quietly, studying each small detail the way a teacher might observe a student solving a complicated puzzle. After a minute, she stepped back and returned to her chair. Ethan watched her with a more focused expression now. Naomi told him honestly that she could not promise miracles. No one responsible ever made that kind of promise. But she believed something important remained in his medical records that the doctors had overlooked. His upper body strength was unusually strong for someone who had lived with limited mobility for 3 years, and certain nerve responses described in the report suggested that the injury might involve blocked communication rather than complete disconnection. Ethan folded his hands slowly, considering her words with the same analytical focus he used during corporate negotiations. He asked her directly if she believed he might walk again. Naomi looked out across the winter skyline before answering. She told him that hope was not a business strategy, and it was not a medical guarantee either. But sometimes the body surprised even the most confident experts. The real question, she explained gently, was not whether recovery was possible. The real question was whether Ethan Caldwell still had enough patience left to try again. The silence that followed Naomi Carter's question seemed to stretch across the entire penthouse like a thin sheet of glass waiting to crack. Ethan Caldwell sat motionless for a moment, his hands resting calmly on the armrests of his chair, while the pale winter light continued drifting across the floor behind him. Patience was a word he had once understood very well. 10 years earlier, patience had meant working through nights inside a cramped office while investors rejected his ideas and competitors dismissed his company as another small startup that would disappear within a year. But that kind of patience had been easier because every hour of effort had moved something forward. The patience Naomi described was different. It meant uncertainty, repetition, and the uncomfortable possibility of trying again only to discover the same disappointment waiting at the end. Ethan studied her expression carefully, searching for any sign of exaggeration or false hope, but Naomi's face remained calm and direct. She was not trying to convince him of anything. She was simply describing a possibility and leaving the decision in his hands. Finally, Ethan allowed a quiet breath to escape and leaned slightly back in his chair. He admitted that 3 years of hospitals and therapy rooms had drained most of his optimism. Every doctor had spoken with confidence during the first appointment and quiet caution during the last. Eventually, hope had begun to feel less like motivation and more like a distraction from the work he still needed to do. Naomi listened and nodded gently, understanding the rhythm of that frustration. She explained that recovery did not always follow the expectations of specialists who focused only on charts and machines. Sometimes improvement came from consistent attention to small movements that seemed insignificant at first. Muscles remembered patterns the way a musician remembered melodies. The body only needed someone patient enough to guide the process long enough for those patterns to return. Ethan looked down at his hands for a moment, slowly flexing his fingers as if testing the idea against reality. Then he asked her a practical question. If he agreed to attempt this process again, how long would it take before anyone could determine whether progress was possible? Naomi answered with quiet honesty. Weeks would reveal small signs. Months would reveal stronger changes. True recovery, if it happened, could take much longer. The room grew silent again as Ethan considered the scale of that commitment. Outside the windows, the late morning sunlight had brightened the snowy paths in Central Park, and the distant movement of traffic across Fifth Avenue looked almost peaceful from 80 floors above the city. Finally, Ethan lifted his gaze back to Naomi. His voice carried the calm authority that had guided his company through countless negotiations. He said that the contract proposal remained exactly the same. 1 year of marriage in exchange for financial compensation that would change her life forever. But if Naomi chose to accept, he would also allow her to supervise a rehabilitation program of her own design during that time. She would have full access to his medical records, physical therapy facilities inside the residence, and any resources necessary to attempt the process she believed might work. Naomi remained quiet for several seconds after hearing the offer. She did not react to the mention of money, and she did not rush to answer. Instead, she looked around the enormous office once more, noticing the clean precision of everything in the room, the ordered shelves, the quiet technology, the view of a city where millions of lives unfolded beneath the same winter sky. Finally, she returned her attention to Ethan Caldwell. She told him that money had never been the most important part of the decision for her. What mattered more was whether the arrangement would allow her to continue supporting the community clinic she worked with in Brooklyn. Ethan responded immediately that the clinic could receive a permanent endowment if the contract proceeded. Naomi considered that answer for a moment, then slowly nodded. The agreement was unusual, complicated, and filled with unknowns. But something about the conversation had convinced her that Ethan Caldwell was not simply offering a contract. Without realizing it, he had also offered the one thing he had not allowed himself in years: another chance to believe that his future might still change. 2 days later, the winter sky above Manhattan turned a deep shade of silver as clouds gathered over the Hudson River, and inside Caldwell Tower, the quiet machinery of one of the most powerful corporations in the country continued its precise rhythm. Executives moved through conference rooms discussing quarterly forecasts. Engineers reviewed software updates that would soon reach millions of users, and investors monitored the steady rise and fall of market numbers on glowing screens. Yet on the top floor, something far more unusual was unfolding. Naomi Carter stepped out of the private elevator once again, this time carrying a simple leather folder instead of the uncertainty that had filled her thoughts during her first visit. The assistant who greeted her spoke politely, but with a different tone now, one that suggested the building already understood she was no longer just a visitor. Word traveled quickly in places where power lived. Naomi followed the assistant through the familiar corridor and into the penthouse office where Ethan Caldwell waited beside the long wall of windows overlooking Central Park. Snow had melted from the pathways below, leaving the park bright and open beneath the cold afternoon sunlight. Ethan turned his chair slightly when Naomi entered, studying her expression as if he already knew she had come with a final answer. Naomi walked toward the desk at an unhurried pace and placed the folder in front of him. Inside were several handwritten notes outlining a structured rehabilitation program that combined guided movement, nerve stimulation exercises, and daily routines designed to retrain muscle memory gradually over time. Ethan opened the folder and read quietly for several minutes while Naomi remained seated across from him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The plan was detailed but practical. It did not promise miracles, and it did not depend on expensive machines. Instead, it relied on discipline, repetition, and patience measured in small daily improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. When Ethan finished reading, he looked up slowly. His expression carried something new. Not quite optimism, but no longer the careful distance he had shown during their first meeting. Naomi finally spoke, explaining that she would agree to the contract under 2 conditions. The first condition was simple. The Brooklyn Community Clinic where she volunteered would receive permanent financial support that allowed it to expand its services and replace outdated equipment. The second condition was more personal. If they entered this agreement, Ethan would commit to the rehabilitation program with the same determination he had once used to build his company. That meant daily sessions, careful attention to progress, and the willingness to continue even when results appeared slow. Ethan listened without interruption, his gray eyes thoughtful as he considered the balance between her requests and the unusual partnership they were about to create. Finally, he nodded once. The clinic would receive a full endowment within the week, and he would follow the program exactly as she designed it. Naomi extended her hand across the desk in a quiet gesture that felt less like a contract and more like the beginning of an alliance. Ethan looked at her hand for a moment before accepting the gesture. His grip was steady, the handshake brief but firm. Somewhere deep within the building, a legal team began preparing documents that would soon transform their private conversation into an official agreement recognized by banks, courts, and corporate boards. But in the quiet penthouse office, the moment felt strangely simple. Two people from entirely different worlds had just agreed to share a year of their lives for reasons that neither of them fully understood yet. As the afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the glass walls of the room, Naomi Carter glanced toward the wheelchair beside the desk and imagined the long path that might lie ahead. She knew the program would not be easy. Progress might arrive slowly, measured in movements so small that most people would overlook them. But she also knew something else. Sometimes the greatest changes in life began with a decision that looked ordinary at first. And at that moment, Ethan Caldwell had just made one of the most important decisions of his life. The contract was signed on a quiet Monday morning beneath a clear winter sky. And although the document itself contained more than 30 pages of legal language, the moment felt strangely simple. Inside a private conference room at Caldwell Tower, a small group of attorneys reviewed the final signatures, while Ethan Caldwell and Naomi Carter sat at opposite ends of the polished table, both aware that the agreement they had just completed would soon become public knowledge across financial news outlets and business networks. By noon, the official announcement moved through the corporate world with the speed of breaking market data. Caldwell Technologies confirmed that its chief executive officer had quietly married Naomi Carter in a private civil ceremony earlier that morning. The message was brief, professional, and carefully written to avoid unnecessary speculation, but speculation arrived anyway. Reporters across Manhattan immediately began searching for information about the woman who had suddenly become the wife of one of the most powerful technology leaders in the country. Some articles described Naomi as a community health worker from Brooklyn, while others focused on the surprising difference between her modest background and Ethan Caldwell's billionaire reputation. Television analysts debated the timing of the marriage and its possible connection to corporate stability. None of them understood the real reason behind the decision, and neither Ethan nor Naomi made any effort to explain it. That evening, Naomi arrived at the Caldwell residence for the first time, not as a visitor, but as its newest resident. The mansion stood along a quiet street on the Upper East Side, its tall windows glowing warmly against the cold air, while security staff maintained the discreet calm expected from a home connected to immense wealth. Inside, the space felt less like a traditional house and more like a carefully designed retreat. Wide hallways, soft lighting, and quiet rooms created an atmosphere of privacy that contrasted sharply with the energy of the city only a few blocks away. Naomi walked through the entrance hall beside Ethan's wheelchair, while a small group of household staff welcomed them with respectful professionalism. Nothing about the moment felt ceremonial. It was simply the beginning of a shared routine. Later that evening, Naomi stood inside a spacious therapy room located on the ground floor of the residence. The space had originally been designed by medical consultants years earlier and contained modern rehabilitation equipment along with wide padded floors intended for physical therapy exercises. Naomi studied the room carefully, imagining how each part of the program she had planned might fit into the environment. Ethan watched from the doorway for a moment before rolling closer. He asked when she intended to begin the training sessions. Naomi looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 8:30 in the evening, and the city outside had begun glowing with the warm lights of restaurants and traffic. She answered simply that the program would start the following morning at 7 o'clock sharp. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, amused by the firmness of her schedule. Naomi explained that consistency mattered more than intensity during the early stages of rehabilitation. Small improvements depended on repetition. Ethan nodded quietly, accepting the instruction without argument. The next morning arrived with a pale blue sky and a sharp wind moving between the buildings of Manhattan. At exactly 7 o'clock, Naomi entered the therapy room carrying a notebook and a simple timer. Ethan was already waiting there in his wheelchair. His expression looked calm but focused, the same look he wore during important corporate meetings. Naomi greeted him with a brief smile before explaining the first stage of the program. They would begin with guided upper body movements designed to strengthen nerve communication between his shoulders, arms, and spine. The exercises looked simple, almost ordinary, but each movement had a purpose. Minutes turned into an hour as Ethan followed her instructions with careful attention. The session ended with quiet concentration rather than dramatic change. Yet when Naomi wrote the first notes in her notebook, she paused briefly, noticing something subtle but encouraging. The response in Ethan's left hand had been slightly stronger than the medical reports predicted. It was only a small detail, something most people would never recognize as important. But Naomi Carter understood the language of small beginnings, and somewhere beneath the quiet discipline of that first morning, she sensed that the year ahead might hold more possibilities than either of them had expected. The second week of training began with a quiet snowfall that covered the streets of Manhattan in a thin layer of white, softening the usual rhythm of traffic outside the Caldwell residence. Inside the therapy room, the routine had already started long before most of the city opened its office doors. Naomi Carter stood beside a wide therapy mat, while Ethan Caldwell followed the structured movements she had introduced during the previous days. The exercises remained simple at first glance: controlled rotations of the shoulders, steady pressure through the arms, careful engagement of the muscles along his spine, yet each repetition carried purpose. Naomi watched every motion closely, sometimes adjusting the angle of his arm or the timing of a movement with calm precision. She did not rush the process, and she did not allow frustration to shape the rhythm of the sessions. Ethan had built his career on speed, decisions made quickly, strategies executed faster than competitors could respond, but this work demanded something entirely different. Progress arrived in fragments measured by seconds rather than achievements measured by headlines. During the early days, Ethan often studied Naomi with quiet curiosity between exercises. She approached the program with the patience of someone who understood that the body followed its own language rather than the expectations of schedules or corporate calendars. Each morning began the same way. Naomi arrived at the therapy room at 7 o'clock, carrying the small notebook, where she recorded every response, every adjustment, every change, no matter how small. Ethan followed the routine without complaint, though occasionally he asked direct questions about the purpose of a particular exercise or the muscles involved in a certain movement. Naomi answered with calm explanations that translated complex neurological ideas into practical steps he could understand. By the end of the second week, a quiet shift had begun to appear in the rhythm of their mornings. Ethan noticed that the muscles along his upper back felt stronger during the sessions, and once or twice Naomi paused in the middle of an exercise to observe the subtle tension forming along the nerves in his shoulders. She wrote detailed notes each time, but avoided unnecessary celebration. Instead, she continued the program with the same steady focus. Outside the therapy room, life inside the Caldwell residence continued with quiet efficiency. Household staff moved carefully through their responsibilities, security teams monitored the property with professional attention, and the city beyond the tall windows remained alive with the endless movement of New York. News coverage about the marriage still circulated across business networks, but inside the house the arrangement had settled into a calm routine. Ethan spent his afternoons working remotely from the office library, while Naomi divided her time between the rehabilitation program and occasional visits to the Brooklyn clinic that had now received its promised financial support. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the program had begun, Naomi entered the therapy room earlier than usual to prepare new equipment she planned to introduce into the next stage of training. As she arranged resistance bands along a support rail, she heard the soft movement of wheels behind her. Ethan had arrived before the scheduled session, something he rarely did. He positioned his wheelchair near the mat and looked toward the equipment with a thoughtful expression. Naomi noticed the change immediately. He appeared more focused than usual, almost impatient in a quiet way. She asked what had brought him down so early. Ethan paused for a moment before answering. He explained that during the previous evening he had attempted a small movement in his room while transferring from the wheelchair to his bed. For a brief second he had felt a faint signal traveling through his left leg, not strong enough to move the muscle completely, but clear enough that he had noticed the sensation. Naomi remained silent while she listened, studying his expression carefully to ensure the memory was not simply wishful thinking. Ethan described the moment again with precise detail. When he finished, Naomi walked slowly toward the notebook resting on the nearby table. She wrote several quick lines before closing it gently. Then she looked back at him with the same calm confidence she had carried since the first day they met. She explained that signals like the one he described often appeared before visible movement returned. They were small reminders that the body had not forgotten how to communicate with itself. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing the idea without allowing excitement to overpower reason. Naomi stepped toward the therapy mat and adjusted the timer on the wall. She told him that the next stage of the program would begin that very morning. The work ahead would be more demanding than anything they had attempted so far. But if the signal he felt was genuine, then the body might finally be ready to answer the question that had been waiting since the accident. Whether patients could truly rebuild what once seemed permanently lost. The next phase of the rehabilitation program began quietly, but carried a different energy from the routines that had come before. Naomi Carter arrived in the therapy room that morning with several additional tools, including resistance bands, a support frame designed to assist with partial standing balance, and a narrow padded platform positioned beside the wall. Outside the tall windows of the Caldwell residence, the early spring sun had begun replacing the cold light of winter, and the city below moved with the familiar rhythm of morning commuters crossing bridges and avenues on their way to another busy day. Inside the room, however, time followed a slower and more deliberate pace. Ethan Caldwell positioned his wheelchair beside the support frame while Naomi explained the purpose of the new stage in the program. For weeks they had focused on strengthening nerve communication through the upper body, gradually rebuilding stability along the spine and shoulders. Now the goal would shift toward awakening the pathways that connected those signals to the lower half of his body. Naomi spoke with calm clarity, describing how the nervous system sometimes behaved like a long, silent highway that simply needed traffic to return before movement could follow. Ethan listened carefully, absorbing every instruction the same way he once studied technical reports from his engineers. The first exercise looked almost symbolic rather than dramatic. Naomi guided his hands onto the support frame and adjusted the position of his feet on the padded platform. She then asked him to focus his attention on a simple action. He would attempt to send a signal to the muscles in his left leg, even if the movement did not appear immediately. The goal was not success on the first attempt, but consistency across many attempts. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, concentrating in the same focused way he used during complicated business negotiations. For several seconds, nothing changed. The room remained quiet except for the faint ticking of the timer Naomi had placed on the wall. Then Naomi noticed a subtle tension forming near the edge of Ethan's knee. It was barely visible, a small tightening beneath the fabric of his training pants, but it was enough for her to lean forward slightly with careful attention. She did not interrupt the moment. Instead, she allowed the attempt to continue until Ethan slowly opened his eyes again. He looked down toward his leg with cautious curiosity, unsure whether he had imagined the sensation or whether the signal had truly traveled where he intended. Naomi spoke gently, confirming what she had seen. The muscle had responded, not strongly enough to create full movement, but clearly enough to prove that the communication pathway still existed. Ethan remained silent for a moment, processing the significance of something that most people would consider insignificant. For 3 years, doctors had explained that recovery might never arrive. Yet here in a quiet therapy room inside his own home, a single muscle had answered a request that had once seemed impossible. Naomi recorded the observation in her notebook with the same calm precision she had used since the beginning of the program. She reminded Ethan that progress would continue slowly and that small signals often appeared long before larger movements returned. The rest of the session continued with steady repetition as Ethan practiced sending the same signal again and again, each attempt guided by Naomi's patient instructions. By the end of the hour, both of them understood that the journey ahead remained long and uncertain, but the quiet evidence of that first response had changed something important in the atmosphere of the room. For the first time since the accident, Ethan Caldwell no longer viewed rehabilitation as an obligation he had already failed. Instead, he began to see it as a process that might still hold unexpected possibilities. As the morning sunlight stretched across the therapy floor, Naomi closed her notebook and glanced toward the support frame beside them. She knew that the next milestone would require even more patience, but she also knew that the body had already whispered the first sign that the path forward might be real. Early summer arrived quietly across Manhattan, bringing warm sunlight that lingered longer each evening and soft breezes that moved gently through the trees of Central Park. Inside the Caldwell residence, the rhythm of rehabilitation had now become a permanent part of daily life. What once felt like an experiment had grown into a disciplined routine that both Ethan Caldwell and Naomi Carter followed with steady focus. Nearly 4 months had passed since the day the program began, and every morning at 7 o'clock the therapy room lights came on while the city outside slowly awakened. By now Ethan's progress was no longer measured only by subtle muscle responses. Strength had begun to return in ways that even the earlier medical reports had not predicted. Naomi adjusted the exercises regularly, increasing resistance and extending the time Ethan spent supporting his weight against the frame. The first time he managed to hold the position for a full 30 seconds, Naomi had quietly written the number in her notebook without celebration, yet the significance of that moment remained clear to both of them. Each small improvement felt like a step forward along a path that had once seemed permanently closed. On a warm June morning, the therapy room filled with bright sunlight reflecting from the tall windows that overlooked the quiet street outside. Naomi had prepared a new stage of training that would test Ethan's balance in a different way. Instead of lifting his body weight briefly before returning to the chair, he would attempt to rise fully into a standing position with support from the frame. The idea had been discussed during previous sessions, but until that morning Naomi believed his strength needed a little more time to develop. Ethan positioned his hands carefully on the metal bars while Naomi adjusted the straps that stabilized his knees. She explained each step calmly, reminding him that the goal was balance rather than speed. Ethan nodded, his expression focused in the way it often appeared during important decisions at work. For a moment the room grew quiet except for the distant sound of traffic beyond the windows. Then Ethan pressed downward through his arms and shifted his weight forward. The motion required careful coordination between muscles that had only recently begun responding again after years of silence. Naomi watched closely, ready to steady him if necessary, but allowing the movement to unfold naturally. Slowly Ethan's torso lifted higher than before. The support frame absorbed part of the effort, while his legs carried the rest. The muscles along his thighs tightened as the signal from his brain traveled through pathways that had once seemed permanently lost. Seconds passed with deliberate patience. Then something extraordinary happened. Ethan straightened enough that his body rose fully above the seat of the wheelchair. For the first time in 3 years he was standing upright, supported by the frame, but clearly balanced on his own legs. Naomi remained calm, though her eyes reflected the quiet importance of the moment. She reminded him to breathe steadily and hold the position while the timer on the wall counted the seconds. 10 seconds passed. Then 15. Ethan looked down briefly at the floor beneath his feet, as if confirming the reality of what his body had just accomplished. When he finally lowered himself back into the chair, the room felt different, filled with a new sense of possibility that had not existed before. Naomi wrote the time carefully in her notebook before closing it. Ethan leaned back slightly, the faintest smile appearing on his face. The achievement was not dramatic enough to attract headlines or public attention, but within the quiet walls of the therapy room it represented something far more meaningful than recognition. It proved that patience, discipline, and belief had begun to rebuild what once seemed beyond recovery. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued its usual movement, unaware that inside a quiet house a man who had once believed his future was fixed had just taken the first true step toward reclaiming it. By the middle of summer, the rhythm inside the Caldwell residence had transformed in a way that no one outside the quiet walls of the house fully understood. What had once been a routine built around careful therapy sessions had now grown into a daily journey that both Ethan Caldwell and Naomi Carter approached with calm determination. Nearly 6 months had passed since the first morning they began the rehabilitation program, and the progress that once appeared in small signals had slowly developed into movements that could no longer be ignored. The therapy room that had once felt like a place of cautious experiments now carried the quiet confidence of a space where real change had taken root. Each morning sunlight poured through the tall windows while Naomi prepared the equipment for the next stage of training. The support frame remained in place, but the exercises had become more advanced. Ethan had gradually learned to shift his weight from one leg to the other while maintaining balance. and the muscles that once struggled to respond had begun strengthening through steady repetition. Naomi watched each movement carefully, her notebook always close at hand as she recorded the details that revealed how far Ethan had come since the beginning of the year. On one particular morning, the city outside was already alive with the sounds of traffic and distant construction, the usual rhythm of Manhattan moving forward beneath a bright blue sky. Inside the therapy room, Naomi adjusted a set of parallel support bars positioned several feet away from the wheelchair. The arrangement was simple but significant. For weeks, Ethan had practiced standing with assistance from the frame, but now Naomi believed he was ready to attempt something more ambitious. She explained the plan calmly, while Ethan listened with focused attention. The goal was not simply standing. This time, he would attempt to move forward while maintaining balance between the bars. The idea sounded small, almost ordinary, but for Ethan it represented a milestone he had not imagined possible when the program first began. He positioned his hands on the bars and took a slow breath as Naomi guided him through the familiar steps that allowed him to rise from the wheelchair. His legs responded with strength that had grown gradually over the past months, and within seconds he stood upright once again. Naomi remained close beside him, ready to steady his balance if necessary, but allowing him to control the movement. For a brief moment he remained still, feeling the weight of his body supported by muscles that had once refused to respond at all. Then Naomi spoke softly, reminding him to focus on the same signals they had practiced every morning. Ethan shifted his weight slightly forward and allowed his right foot to move a few inches ahead. The motion was slow and deliberate, guided by concentration rather than speed. Naomi watched closely as his body adjusted to the change in balance. The second foot followed a moment later, completing a short but unmistakable step. The room fell completely silent as Ethan realized what had just happened. It was not a dramatic stride across the floor, and it lasted only a moment. Yet it represented the first true step he had taken since the accident that changed his life. Naomi allowed the silence to remain for several seconds before quietly writing the time and distance in her notebook. Ethan looked down at the floor beneath his feet, then toward the bars that had supported him during the movement. A quiet smile appeared on his face, not the confident smile of a billionaire accustomed to success, but the genuine expression of someone who had just rediscovered a part of himself he once believed was lost forever. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued its endless motion, unaware that inside the quiet therapy room a man had just crossed the invisible line between recovery and possibility. And as Naomi closed her notebook, she understood that the final months of their unusual agreement would now lead them toward a future neither of them had imagined when the contract was first signed.